June 6th, 1944, 9 o'clock in the morning. 13 American paratroopers are crouched in a drainage ditch in a Norman field, their boots sinking into French mud, their hearts hammering against their ribs. Less than 200 yards away, 4 German howitzers are screaming metal across the French countryside, raining 105mm shells down on Utah Beach, where thousands of their countrymen are crawling through surf and fire and death. 13 men against 60, against 4 artillery pieces already tearing apart the exit causeways from the beach, the only way off, the only way forward for the entire American invasion force at Utah Beach. Close those causeways and you trap an army in the sand. The man in charge of those 13 is not supposed to be there at all. He has no interest in being a hero. He never did. His company commander was killed 40 minutes after midnight. The C-47 carrying most of Easy Company's headquarters section shot out of the Norman sky by German flak. He had landed in a dark field far from his objective. He had lost his rifle in the drop. But now, with no orders, no artillery, no armor, no time, this quiet, serious young man from Lancaster, Pennsylvania, is going to do something that military academies at West Point will still be teaching 80 years later. His name is Richard D. Winters, and what he chose to do next, in the next 2 hours, with 13 men and a handful of grenades, isn't just a story about World War II. It is a story about what a human being is capable of when the moment demands everything. Before we talk about Brécourt Manor, we need to talk about Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And now, before we go any further, if you're already in, hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Every week on Heroes Under Fire, we tell the stories of the men who carried the weight so history could move forward. You don't want to miss what's coming. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Richard Davis Winters was born on January 21, 1918, in the small town of New Holland, Pennsylvania, a patchwork of dairy farms, church steeples, and quiet county roads in Lancaster County. His family didn't have much. His father, Richard Sr., was a steady, unremarkable man who worked without complaint. His mother, Edith, ran the household with the kind of quiet competence that modest circumstances demand. When Dick was around 2 years old, the family moved a few miles east to Ephrata, and then again to Lancaster proper when he was 8. Lancaster was a mid-sized Pennsylvania city, not quite country, not quite urban, the kind of place where people didn't ask what you were going to be, they asked what you were willing to do. And it shaped him the way that honest, hard-working towns shape their children, quietly and permanently. Dick Winters was not a loud kid. He was not the type to hold court at the corner diner or start fights to prove something. He was disciplined, focused. He loved sports, wrestling most of all, a sport that rewards both physical conditioning and mental control in equal measure. He worked part-time jobs throughout high school to help the family and save money for the future. He graduated Lancaster Boys High School in 1937 and earned admission to Franklin and Marshall College right there in Lancaster. Not because it was elite, not because it opened doors to the right rooms, because it was possible, because it required sacrifice and sustained effort, and Dick Winters had always respected effort above everything else. At Franklin and Marshall, he studied economics. He joined the Delta Sigma Phi fraternity. He played intramural football and basketball. And he made a quiet, difficult decision partway through college. He gave up wrestling, his favorite sport, because his part-time jobs and academic workload didn't leave room for both. He chose the degree over the sport. That small act of deliberate sacrifice tells you more about who this man was than any medal citation ever could. He graduated in June 1941 with a bachelor's degree in economics, earning the highest academic standing in the entire business college. Think about who this is. A working-class kid from Lancaster, Pennsylvania. No famous father, no connections, no scholarship endowed by someone else's money. Just relentless, quiet discipline.
applied over 4 years in a world that was already beginning to burn at its edges. He had a plan, a good plan, a sensible plan, a business career, maybe a family, a small, dignified, well-earned life in Pennsylvania. And then came December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor changed everything for a generation of Americans. But here is something that separates the real Dick Winters from the movie version of a war hero. He didn't sprint to the recruitment office the next morning with his chest on fire. He had already voluntarily registered for the draft and been inducted on August 25, 1941, before Pearl Harbor, specifically to complete his 1-year obligation and free himself for civilian life should America stay out of the war. In his own memoir, Beyond Band of Brothers, written with Colonel Cole C. Kingseed, Winters was direct about it. He felt a strong sense of duty, but he had no desire to get into the war. No desire to get into the war. Let that settle for a moment. He didn't want glory. He didn't want his name on a monument. What Dick Winters wanted, more than almost anything else in the world, was to build something. A career, a family, a life with clean edges and honest work. But the world had other plans. When America entered the war after Pearl Harbor, Winters was already in uniform, and with the clarity of a man who understood that the moment required more than a desk and a 1-year clock, he applied for officer candidate school at Fort Benning, Georgia. There, he made friends with a fellow Pennsylvanian named Lewis Nixon, a friendship of loyalty and quiet mutual respect that would last the rest of both their lives. And then he made one final choice that sealed his fate forever. He volunteered for the Paratroopers.
Airborne training in 1942 was not for the faint of anything. The 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment was an experimental unit, the first regiment in American military history to undergo airborne training as a fully formed organization rather than as individually assigned volunteers. Their training ground was Camp Toccoa, Georgia, in the Blue Ridge heat of summer. The numbers tell you everything you need to know about what that meant. Of 500 officers who volunteered, only 148 completed the program. Of 5,000 enlisted men, fewer than 1,800 made it through. Easy Company, Company E, 2nd Battalion, 506th PIR, was commanded by a man history has not been kind to. First Lieutenant Herbert Sobel was a gifted trainer and an appalling leader. He ran his men through punishing physical regiments. He penalized them arbitrarily. He generated the kind of resentment that follows an officer around like a shadow. Winters served as Sobel's executive officer, and by every account he was Sobel's tactical superior in every measurable way. Calmer, more precise, more trusted by the men. Sobel attempted to court-martial Winters on a fabricated charge. Winters requested a formal review rather than accept unjust punishment. The battalion commander set the punishment aside. Sobel filed a second charge the very next day. Within weeks, several of Easy Company's senior NCOs threatened to surrender their stripes if Sobel was not removed from command. It was an extraordinary act of collective defiance, the kind that could have ended careers. And it worked. Sobel was transferred to a parachute training school. Winters returned to the company as platoon leader. Those men, Guarnier, Lipton, Ranney, the others, had trusted Winters enough to risk their military careers on the principle that he, not Sobel, should be leading them into war. That trust was not manufactured. It was earned, slowly and honestly, over 2 years of watching Dick Winters be everything Sobel was not: calm, fair, competent, and straight with every man under his command. In September 1943, the regiment shipped to England. They trained intensely in the village of Aldbourne in Wiltshire. Tactical exercises, jump rehearsals, long marches through the English countryside, preparing for an invasion of Europe that everyone knew was coming and no one talked about openly. In February 1944, a new company commander arrived, First Lieutenant Thomas Meehan, a good man, respected, steady, the kind of officer you were glad to follow. He would be dead before his boots touched French soil.
On the night of June 5th into June 6, 1944, the C-47s of the 50th 6th PIR climbed into a dark sky over the English Channel and turned south toward Normandy. Somewhere in that formation, the plane carrying Lieutenant Meehan and most of Easy Company's headquarters section was struck by German anti-aircraft fire and went down in flames. There were no survivors. Dick Winters landed in a dark Norman field. He had lost his M1 rifle in the drop. He oriented himself by the stars, assembled a small group of scattered paratroopers, some from the 82nd Airborne, separated from their own units, and began moving toward the company's objectives near Sainte-Marie-du-Mont. He was the acting commanding officer of Easy Company. He was 26 years old, and somewhere in the dark ahead of him, he could already hear the guns.
June 6, 1944. By 8:30 in the morning, the Norman sky had shifted from black to cold gray. The invasion was hours old and already bleeding. At Utah Beach, 6 kilometers northeast of a small Norman dairy farm called Brécourt Manor, thousands of American soldiers were fighting through the waterline, pushing toward the causeways that led inland from the sand. Those causeways were everything. If men couldn't move through them, the beach became a kill box, a trap, a place to die in the surf while the tide came back in. And from a tree-lined field at Brécourt Manor, 4 German 105mm howitzers were firing directly onto those causeways and the men trying to cross them. At the 506th PIR rally point near the farmhouse at Culeville, Winters had assembled his small force. He could hear the guns. They were close, 300 meters away, perhaps less, just south of the nearest hedgerow. Major Robert Strayer, the battalion commander, gave him a 3-word order. Take care of it, Winters. No artillery support, no air support, no armor, no time for reconnaissance, no reinforcements on the way. Picture what Winters had. 11 men from Easy Company. Sergeant Bill Gornaire, a South Philadelphia tough guy who had just learned that morning his brother had been killed in Italy and was still there, still standing, still ready. Buck Compton, a former UCLA baseball star turned jump officer, with hands steady enough to throw a grenade through a keyhole. Don Malarkey from Astoria, Oregon, as reliable under fire as any man alive. Carwood Lipton, precise and quiet. Joe Toy, who would fight that morning like a man who had decided fear was someone else's problem. Joe Liebgott, Mike Ranney, Cleveland Petty, John Plesha, Popeye Wynn. Against them, approximately 60 to 80 German defenders, including elite soldiers from the 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment, German paratroopers, dug into hardened positions around 4 howitzers, connected by a network of communication trenches. Machine gun nests covered every open approach to the battery. The field in front of the German position offered 400 meters of open ground, nothing to hide behind, nothing to crawl through, no cover of any kind. A frontal assault would not have been a battle. It would have been a burial. Winters had minutes to think. And in those minutes, this is what separated him from a lesser officer in that moment. He looked at the ground. He noticed the drainage ditches. 2 irrigation ditches, deep and hedge-lined, ran from almost the farmhouse directly to the left flank of the German position. If his men moved through those ditches, crouched, fast, disciplined, and quiet, they could approach within 50 meters of the first gun without ever crossing open ground, without ever being seen. That was the key. Not courage alone, not firepower, terrain. He later wrote in his memoir, "Our key would be initiative, an immediate appraisal of the situation, skillful use of the terrain, and our ability to destroy one gun at a time." 1 gun at a time, not 4 guns, not the whole position, not a grand sweep that a general plans on a map somewhere safe and warm, just the next gun. This is the philosophy of a mind that has beaten panic, a mind shaped by 2 years of iron preparation, by the hard school of Tocoa, by the discipline of a Lancaster kid who gave up wrestling because the degree mattered more.
All of it, every early morning run, every stripped-down choice, had been building toward 15 minutes in a Norman field where the right thought, held clearly, was the difference between victory and slaughter. He ordered every man to drop all equipment except ammunition and grenades. He positioned two .30 caliber machine gun teams on the edges of the tree line to form a base of suppressive fire. He assigned Gournere, Compton, and Malarkey to eliminate the German machine gun position at the western end of the tree line, the one that would cut the assault team apart the moment they moved. And then Dick Winters climbed down into the ditch and led his men forward. The morning was cold. The Norman bocage, that ancient patchwork of earthen walls and dense hedgerows that had divided this countryside for 1,000 years, swallowed them as they moved low and fast along the covered approach. Somewhere behind them, the distant percussion of Utah Beach. Somewhere ahead, the steady, methodical bark of German howitzers working the causeways. 13 men, one ditch, one plan. What happened in the next 90 minutes would be studied at West Point for the rest of the century. 9:05 in the morning. Givers gives the signal. The two .30 caliber machine guns open up from their positions in the tree line, hammering the western German positions with suppressive fire. Instantly, the air above the ditch becomes a geometry of flying metal. German return fire raking the hedges, cutting through leaves and branches at chest height. But Winters and his assault team are already moving, low and fast through the ditch, closing the distance to the first gun. Compton, Gournere, and Malarkey reach the flanking machine gun nest that covers gun number 1. They don't hesitate. Grenades first, arcing through the cold Norman air, dropping into the pit. Then they assault through the smoke and clear the position. The flank is open. Winters leads the assault on gun number 1. They come up out of the ditch and go. Private Popeye Wynn catches a grenade fragment, a wound in the backside, painful and profane, and yells something unprintable into the Norman morning that makes two men almost laugh in the middle of a firefight. Private Joe Toy survives 2 separate grenade explosions within minutes of each other, somehow still standing, still moving forward. The gun pit is reached. The paratroopers place blocks of TNT down the barrel of the howitzer and detonate the charge with captured German stick grenades. Gun number 1 is destroyed. One howitzer that will never again fire on Utah Beach. He later wrote in his memoir, "Our key would be initiative, an immediate appraisal of the situation, skillful use of the terrain, and our ability to destroy one gun at a time. One gun at a time. Not 4 guns, not the whole position, not a grand sweep that a general plans on a map somewhere safe and warm, just the next gun." This is the philosophy of a mind that has beaten panic. A mind shaped by 2 years of iron preparation, by the hard school of Tocoa, by the discipline of a Lancaster kid who gave up wrestling because the degree mattered more. All of it, every early morning run, every stripped-down choice, had been building toward 15 minutes in a Norman field where the right thought, held clearly, was the difference between victory and slaughter. He ordered every man to drop all equipment except ammunition and grenades. He positioned 2 .30 caliber machine gun teams on the edges of the tree line to form a base of suppressive fire. He assigned Gournere, Compton, and Malarkey to eliminate the German machine gun position at the western end of the tree line, the one that would cut the assault team apart the moment they moved. And then Dick Winters climbed down into the ditch and led his men forward. The morning was cold. The Norman bocage, that ancient patchwork of earthen walls and dense hedgerows that had divided this countryside for 1,000 years, swallowed them as they moved low and fast along the covered approach. Somewhere behind them, the distant percussion of Utah Beach. Somewhere ahead, the steady, methodical bark of German howitzers working the causeways. 13 men, one ditch, one plan. What happened in the next 90 minutes would be studied at West Point for the rest of the century. 9:30 in the morning. The Germans have understood what is happening to them. They are being rolled up from their left flank, a direction their defensive positions had not been fully prepared to handle, and now they know it. An MG-42, positioned 80 meters further east along the tree line, opens fire along the length of the communication trench. The sound of an MG-42 in full fire is unlike anything else on a battlefield. 1,200 rounds per minute, a mechanical tearing sound that men who heard it never forgot for the rest of their lives. Winters orders his .30 caliber teams forward to suppress the German gun. Then he does something for which there is no page in any manual. He crawls. Under active machine gun fire along the muddy floor of the German trench, Winters moves forward toward gun number 3. Joe Toye, the same man who survived 2 grenades 40 minutes ago, moves beside him. They reach the gun pit. Winters throws a grenade into the position, then charges it. Gun number 3 is taken. 3 howitzers destroyed. 3 German artillery positions that will never again fire on the men coming ashore at Utah Beach. By now, Winters and his men have been fighting for nearly 90 minutes. They are exhausted, low on grenades, running on the last reserves of everything: ammunition, adrenaline, and the pure forward momentum that keeps men moving when their bodies are telling them to stop. And then, through the bocage, moving at a dead run across open ground and ignoring the German fire entirely, arrives First Lieutenant Ronald Spears of Dog Company. He heard the firefight from across the fields. He didn't wait for orders. He didn't call back to battalion. He just moved toward the sound of the guns, the way certain men always do. His men, fresh and grenades intact, assault gun number 4 from above ground rather than through the trenches. It is audacious. It is exactly the kind of decision that ends careers or wins wars, depending on the outcome. It works. Gun number 4 is destroyed. 10:30 in the morning. All 4 howitzers are silent. The causeways from Utah Beach are no longer under German artillery fire. The men coming ashore in the next hours will not know why the shelling stopped. They will not know that 13 paratroopers in a drainage ditch, joined by a handful of others who chose to run toward the fight, had just quietly changed the course of their morning, and possibly their lives. The official Distinguished Service Cross citation, presented to Winters by Lieutenant General Omar Bradley on July 2, 1944, reads in part, First Lieutenant Winters, with enlisted men, advanced through intense enemy automatic weapons fire, putting out of action guns of the battery. Unswerving in his determination to complete his self-appointed and extremely hazardous task, First Lieutenant Winters and his group withdrew for reinforcements, returned, and the remaining guns were put out of action, resulting in decreased opposition to our forces landing on the beachhead. At West Point, this action is still taught today as the textbook definition of how to assault a defended fixed position with a numerically inferior force. If you're watching this and feeling something, that's the point. Give this video a thumbs up. It takes 2 seconds and it helps this channel reach the people who need to hear these stories. We're building something real here. Subscribe and be part of it. June 6, 1944. By 11 in the morning, Dick Winters walked back across the bocage toward the American lines. He was alive. He had been on French soil for less than 10 hours. He had fought for nearly 2 of them with a force smaller than a baseball roster against a defended artillery battery that outmanned him 5-1. He had done it without a plan longer than the next 30 meters, without support of any kind, and without losing a single man from Easy Company in the assault itself. But alive does not mean untouched. The physical toll was real. Winters had been moving at combat intensity, running, crawling, throwing grenades, clearing trenches at close range for the better part of 2 hours in full equipment over uneven ground. The shrapnel fragments that had wounded Popeye Wynn and pushed Joe Toye to the edge of what a human body can absorb were reminders of how narrow the margins had been. Any one of those exchanges in the trenches could have gone differently. Any one of those grenades thrown a second later. Any one of those machine gun bursts aimed 6 inches lower. The psychological weight was something else entirely. Winters had just commanded men in combat for the first time in his life. He had given orders that sent human beings toward loaded guns and exploding ordnance. Some of those men had been wounded. He had felt the specific responsibility that only combat commanders ever feel. The knowledge that the men to your left and right are alive or dead in direct proportion to how clearly you thought and how quickly you decided. That weight does not lift when the shooting stops. It follows you off the field, through the hedgerows, back to whatever cold farmhouse serves as a command post, and then into every quiet moment for the rest of your life. That evening, Winters sat down and wrote his after-action report with the same precision he brought to everything. He documented the terrain, the approach, the sequencing of each gun, the intelligence captured at gun number 2. He named his men. He accounted for every casualty. He recommended several of them for decorations. He did not write about how he felt. He never did, but his comrades did. Sergeant Carwood Lipton, one of the most respected NCOs in Easy Company and a man who watched Winters closely throughout the entire war, later said that what struck him most about Dick Winters in combat was not his courage, though the courage was undeniable, but his absolute stillness under pressure. The way the noise and the chaos and the lethality of the situation that seemed to make him more focused rather than less, quieter rather than louder, clearer rather than confused. That stillness, Lipton believed, is what kept them alive. In the days that followed Brécourt Manor, Easy Company fought through the hedgerows of Normandy, battled for the critical town of Carentan, and absorbed casualties that reduced the company from full strength to a shadow of itself. Winters led them through all of it. When he was promoted to executive officer of 2nd Battalion in late 1944, the men of Easy Company received the news with a pride they couldn't entirely hide and a grief they didn't try to. They were glad for him. They didn't want to lose him. Both things were true at the same time. That is what genuine leadership costs the people who experience it. Richard Winters came home from the war the same way he had lived before it, quietly and without fanfare. He returned to Pennsylvania. He settled in Hershey, not far from Lancaster, the county that had first shaped him. He married Ethel Ann Estepy in 1948, a woman of steady character and deep patience, and together they built the small, dignified life he had always wanted. A farmhouse, land, a pig farm he ran himself with his own hands, the same hands that had thrown grenades into German gun pits on the morning of D-Day. He went to work for the Hershey Foods Corporation. He raised 2 children. He coached Little League. He went to church. He mowed his own lawn. For decades, almost no one in his community knew what he had done at Brécourt Manor. He didn't tell them. He didn't need them to know. But the war was always there, in the way it is always there for the men who fight them. Winters slept with the window open, even in winter, because he couldn't stand in closed spaces without an exit. He startled at sudden loud sounds. He replayed the faces of the men he had led, the ones who came home and the ones who didn't, with a regularity that never fully softened with time. He carried the specific grief of a commander, which is different from the grief of a soldier. A commander carries not only his own losses, but the losses he ordered, the losses he could not prevent, and the losses he replays on the long nights, asking whether a different decision, 10 seconds earlier, might have changed the outcome. He never spoke publicly about any of it. Then, in the early 1990s, a historian named Stephen Ambrose tracked him down. Ambrose had been interviewing veterans of Easy Company for a book about the 506th PIR, a book that would eventually become Band of Brothers, published in 1992. Winters cooperated reluctantly, slowly, and always with the condition that the story was about the company, not about him. He pushed back on passages that elevated him at the expense of the men around him. He corrected accounts that made the battles cleaner or more cinematic than they had actually been. He wanted the truth told. He did not want to be the center of it.
When HBO adapted the book into a miniseries in 2001, the world discovered Dick Winters. The portrayal by actor Damian Lewis introduced a generation of viewers to a style of leadership they recognized instinctively as rare: calm, competent, consistent, and completely without ego. Letters arrived at his farmhouse in Hershey by the thousands. Veterans wrote to him. Young soldiers wrote to him from Iraq and Afghanistan. School children wrote to him from places he had never been and would never visit. He answered as many as he could. In 2006, he published his own memoir, Beyond Band of Brothers, written with Colonel Cole C. Kingseed. In it, he was characteristically precise, characteristically modest, and characteristically direct about the things that mattered to him most. Not the battles, but the men. Not the decorations, but the relationships. He wrote about Lewis with the warmth of a man describing the best friendship of his life. He wrote about Carwood Lipton, Bill Guarnere, Don Malarkey, and the others with a specificity and affection that made clear he had been thinking about them every day for 60 years. Near Sainte-Marie-de-Mont in Normandy, not far from the field where those 13 men crouched in a drainage ditch on the most consequential morning of the 20th century, there stands today a bronze monument to Richard D. Winters. He was dedicated in 2012, 1 year after his death. A Norman farmer donated the land. French schoolchildren raised part of the funding. The inscription reads, "In memory of the man who gave us the confidence to follow him, from the men of Easy Company." Richard Davis Winters died on January 2, 2011, at his home in Hershey, Pennsylvania. He was 92 years old. He was surrounded by his family. He had asked that his death not be announced publicly until after his burial, one final act of privacy from a man who had spent his last decades quietly deflecting a fame he never sought. He was buried in Hershey Cemetery. The grave is modest, exactly as he would have wanted.
There is a question that follows every story like this one, and it deserves an honest answer. What do we actually take from it? Not the spectacle, not the grenades and the trenches and the tactical brilliance, though all of that is real and all of it matters. What we take is something quieter and more durable than any of that. The first thing Dick Winters teaches us is that preparation is a form of courage. Every decision he made in that Norman field on the morning of June 6th was paid for in advance, by 2 years of hard training at Toccoa, by the discipline he built in Lancaster before the war, by the thousands of small choices to do the difficult thing rather than the comfortable one. When the moment came, he didn't rise to the occasion, he fell back on what he had already built. Courage without preparation is just adrenaline. What Winters had was something far more reliable. The second thing he teaches us is about the nature of leadership. He never wanted to be in charge. He never campaigned for command, never positioned himself, never built a reputation at someone else's expense. He simply did his job at the highest possible standard, every single day, and the men around him responded to that with a trust that no promotion order could manufacture. The NCOs who threatened to surrender their stripes rather than fight under Sobel weren't following a rank. They were following a man. There is a difference, and most people who have worked inside any organization, military or otherwise, have felt that difference in their bones. The third thing is perhaps the hardest to sit with. Dick Winters spent the most decorated years of his life trying to get back to the quiet farm and the decent, ordinary life that the war interrupted. He wanted Lancaster. He wanted the pig farm in Hershey and the Little League games and the open window in winter. He got all of it, eventually, and he still carried the weight of every man he had ever led into fire, every single day, until the morning of January 2nd, 2011, when he finally set it down. That is what the uniform actually costs, not the battles, the after. Now, if this story meant something to you, if you found yourself thinking about those 13 men in a drainage ditch in a Norman field, about a quiet kid from Lancaster who gave up wrestling because the degree mattered more, about what it actually looks like when a human being is fully prepared for the worst moment of their life, then do one thing right now. Subscribe to Heroes Under Fire. Every week, we bring you stories exactly like this one. Stories that the textbooks skip, that the movies compress, that the history classes never have enough time for. Hit the like button if Dick Winters earned it. He would have been modest about it, but the algorithm is not, and it helps us find more people who deserve to hear these stories. And share this video with someone who needs to be reminded what quiet, disciplined, unglamorous excellence actually looks like in practice. Not the Hollywood version, the real one. These men gave everything. The least we can do is remember them clearly. If Dick Winters' story moved you, the least we can do is hit like and subscribe. These men gave everything. The only thing we're asking from you is a click. Don't let their stories disappear. See you next week.